Now let's discuss the GDP again. It is the domestic product. It is gross. That is the G in the GDP. What does that mean? We don't want to account for depreciation. It's too difficult. Some of the cars that we produce are junk. But how many exactly? It's hard to know. Accountants have measurements for depreciation, but it's hard to rely on that. So usually we really ignore the net domestic product and we look at the gross domestic product. I ask you to look at this website, www.bea.gov. That shows you a lot of our statistics on the gross domestic product. All that came after the Depression, when we wanted to really know what the performance of the economy is all about. And we wanted to follow the recession and the contraction and then the expansion that came after that. And then, of course, the government was interested in trying to reduce those cycles to prevent the suffering of unemployment and of poverty. And that is one of the aspects of the Great Depression that really made a big difference from the 30s. Now, the GDP is also a measurement of final products, which means we don't look at intermediate products. Example, if there is lumber that's made to go into a furniture product, that lumber is sold by the lumber company and it goes to a furniture company. Well, let's say that the lumber company produces $1 million worth of lumber and the furniture company produces $5 million of furniture with that lumber. Well, the total product, the total contribution to GDP is really $5 million. If you were to say, well, the lumber company sold $1 million worth of lumber and the furniture company sold $5 million worth of furniture, you would be counting $6 million. Well, that would be double counting. It's only $5 million. Another way you could look at it is $1 million worth of lumber that's produced, and then the added value of the furniture company that made the $1 million worth of lumber into 5, which means they've added, or they produced a value added of $4 million. 4 million plus the 1 million equals 5. Well, just look at the final product, the furniture, $5 million. The GDP cannot include also the intermediate products. Otherwise, you would be double counting and you would be counting everything over and over and over again. That wouldn't be right. There would not be a correct measurement of the GDP. Now, the GDP is in the expenditure approach. There is something else called the income approach. When we look at all the profits, all the payroll checks, all the salaries, all the rents, well, that's a different approach. It's the national income approach, and we don't use it as much. But the national income should be the same as the GDP. When we look at the expenditure approach, we think of the products, of the services. We imagine the cars being made, the shoes being produced, the clothing, the movies, the theaters, the services of doctors. All that goes into the GDP. Now, the same can be translated to salaries, profits, income, and rent, and that would be the income approach, which is not as often used, but it is certainly also useful. The GDP is a more common measure of the economy's performance. Now let's talk about unemployment and inflation. What does it mean? Unemployment. There is always some unemployment. Why? There is a natural rate of unemployment. Some people cannot always work. For example, frictional unemployment. That's when people have to change jobs because of personal reasons. Let's say they move to another state. They marry somebody. They quit their job, they take another job. Or maybe they go to retraining. Well, there is always that element that's called the frictional unemployment. There is nothing the government really can or should do about it because that is frictional unemployment. Then you have structural unemployment. Well, that is something that is due to the change in technology, and some people are just not trained to work with the current technology. We should try to minimize that by offering education as much as possible because we want to retrain people to get new jobs. But some structural unemployment probably always happens because technology constantly changes and some products are no longer useful. For example, typewriters are not really used that much anymore, and people that are typewriter experts are not as much in demand as computer experts. That's normal. And people that could repair old-fashioned TVs now with a flat-screen TV may be out of a job if they cannot retrain and be able to repair the flat-screen TVs. And that is the structural unemployment. Then you have other things like seasonal unemployment. In certain seasons, some people don't work. They can't work. How can a gardener work in the middle of winter with the snow on the ground? Not much. How can somebody who deals with maybe beach resorts work in the winter? And vice versa. Somebody who is in the snow plowing business, he will not work in summer. So some people are tied to seasons, and that's called seasonal unemployment, and that is normal and it is unescapable. But you have some other types of unemployment that are due to the business cycle. That's called cyclical unemployment. And that happens when the economy goes down, when people get laid off. Cyclical unemployment could be reduced or avoided if the economy was kept going at a good clip, at a good level of performance or a good level of GDP. The rate of growth of the GDP has to follow the rate of growth of the population. Because don't forget, the GDP has also to do with how many people there are in the country. The more people are in the country, we expect the GDP to be, of course, greater. That's why we sometimes measure the GDP as a GDP per capita. So we take the GDP of a country and divide it by the number of people there. And then we get the GDP per capita. That gives you a more accurate measurement of the performance of that country, because a huge country obviously will have more GDP than a tiny country. But some small countries have much higher GDP per capita than big countries. For example, Singapore has a greater GDP per capita than Egypt, for example, much greater. They're more productive. Egypt is a rather large country with maybe 70 million people, but they don't produce that much. Singapore is a very small country with a few million people, but they produce a lot of services, a lot of products. They're very successful. So is Japan, which is a country of about 100 million people. They produce almost as much as the United States. Not quite, but not very far. So what we have is GDP per capita is a measurement of performance of an economy is very important. One more thing we cannot forget is the value of the money. The GDP sometimes grows not because really we're producing more, but because the prices are rising. If prices are rising, well then you might think that you're producing more, but you're producing the same thing. Look at the price of a gallon of gasoline today versus 10 years ago or 20 years ago. The value of the money has changed. Now, $1 doesn't buy you a gallon of gasoline. It used to. Now it buys you maybe a pint of gasoline. So there is a question of the value of the money. People that want to check the economy's performance will usually look at the real GDP, which means the GDP divided by a price index. How do we get these price indexes? Well, these are measured by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. Their website is www.bls.gov. They keep track of unemployment and inflation. What is inflation? It's a change of prices. We use indexes for that. For example, the consumer's price index, or the producer price index, or the GDP deflator. There is a number of indexes. These are estimated by statisticians. They look at the prices of things over the years. They look at maybe a basket of product. How much was a can of tomato paste? How much was a gallon of milk? How much was a gallon of gasoline? And other products years ago. And compare it to what that would cost today. They come up with an index. They can say, for example, the prices now may be double of what they were 10 years ago. Well, in that case, you can estimate the inflation rate. It can be 0, it can be 1%, it can be 4%. Now, what happens if the inflation rate is negative, minus 2%? That's called deflation. In that case, prices are going down. But don't be so happy if prices are going down. It means maybe your salary is going down or your wages are going down. And we find that when there is deflation, the economy is not doing well. When there is a depression, there is also deflation. Deflation is not a good thing. Inflation is not a good thing either. If you have a lot of inflation, you have what we call distortions. Creditors, people that are owed money, become unhappy because they are given back money that is depreciated. People that owe money might be happy because the inflation makes it easier for them to pay off their debts. And the contrary happens with deflation. But people get upset about inflation or deflation, and they tend to become politically even violent. There have been many wars because of inflation. In Germany, there was hyperinflation. It caused a war. Many times there might be a revolution because the masses will rebel when prices go up and up and up and they feel helpless. So governments don't want to have a lot of inflation. It can create a lot of unrest, maybe a revolution, maybe a civil war, maybe some other catastrophe. And also deflation does the same. When there is deflation, people get desperate, they can get violent. The money becomes scarce, and the violence is the answer sometimes that they find. And it has happened many times in history. So the government really try to keep the money, or should try to keep their money value stable. In this country, we have the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve job is to keep the inflation at bay, to reduce inflation or deflation, keep the prices as stable as possible. It's not always possible to keep them perfectly stable, like it's not possible to keep an engine from vibrating a little bit, but it's all in the amount. A small amount is acceptable, a large amount is not.